In this module, we're going to learn how to sculpt a large cliff. So I decided to make a little concept here. Before we start this module, I just wanted to quick overview. So here we have our little stone that we sculpted in the first place. And then I wanted to introduce the cliffs, but at the same time, I wanted to make some sort of finished piece just so it makes the tutorial a little bit more interesting. So I decided to come up with this floating island where the tree will grow at the top. We'll have our little rock here, we'll have a little river going down, and here we'll have our cliff piece. And so in this case, it will be sort of like a chunk of the cliff floating around, but those very same techniques could be used for creating any cliffs, really. So I've already imported the plane into 3ds Max, just like we did in the first module. And that is just so I can simply get a little bit of a overhang of the cliff here. So depending on what kind of cliffs you're doing for games, you will use different techniques. So because we're doing this one piece here, I'm actually going to just go ahead and sculpt this entire island piece as one piece. But if you are doing it for game environment, you might need to make basically modular pieces. So that would be just one piece of the puzzle, and then you connect them inside the engine to make your cliff work. But just for the sake of this tutorial, we are only learning how to sculpt the cliffs and how to get the shapes right, and not necessarily how later on put them in game, although that's also a very important part. Okay, so let's go ahead. So I'm going to do the same pretty much thing as we did last time and start with the base mesh. But this time I'm just going to go ahead and be a little bit more rough. I'm going to go into shaded mode here. And I'm just going to convert this to editable poly. We're going to start here. So the idea is I'm not going to follow the concept 100%. In fact, I drew this concept just to give me an idea of what I actually want to do. As you can tell, I'm not really the best concept artist. I only do that for just a general vision. And that's very important. If you create your own props and you don't have a concept art, it's always a great idea to just doodle something just to give you an idea of where you're trying to get. It doesn't have to be perfect, it doesn't have to be beautiful, it just has to give you a hint of where you're going. Because if you just going to go into 3ds Max and start putting things together, a lot of people have this 3D vision and they have good idea of what they're trying to achieve, and so they might be able to pull it off without any concept art. But it's much more easier if you have some kind of reference. If you work without reference, you're basically going to struggle a lot because you don't know what the end goal is, so you always get lost. When you model something, it takes you a long time, and if you doodle something, it takes you about 5 minutes. So it's much better to spend 10 minutes on creating a doodle to see where you're going, and if your idea doesn't work, you can always do it again, doodle another one, and just modify your shapes a little bit. It's much better than going back and modeling the whole thing again. So here we go. I'm just blocking it in right now. So just using these squares. And again, I'm trying to use bold shapes. I'm just going to go into my material editor here and select a gray. Just apply it to everything. So I'm just going to go ahead and work a little bit faster now because, well, the first tutorial should give you a really good idea on how to create a block out. And in here, I'm just trying to show you that it's pretty much the same techniques for no matter what you do. You always start with a block out and then you go from there. So I'm just duplicating these rocks here, just trying to get a good shape. So I'm trying to create this island. I'm starting with the bigger picture here, bigger pieces, and then I'm going to add some small ones afterwards. Put this here. Again, I'm using the X-ray mode, so Alt-X to use the X-ray mode. Just gonna move this here. And I'll have this little waterfall, but that's something I will be adding later. In this tutorial series, we're only covering the base meshes, the sculpting, and in the future tutorials, I'm hoping to create a tutorial where we'll learn how to bake all this and put this in the engine and actually use this for a practical video game. So something like this. It is slightly trickier to create these shapes for video tutorials simply because whenever I do these professionally for work, I spend a couple hours just playing around with the shapes, getting them into right places. And this is always the trickiest part for me, because finding out what you're trying to achieve is much harder than going in and sculpting. Because sculpting, once you develop the technique, it doesn't take too long. It takes a few minutes. Well, maybe a couple hours, depending on the size of the shape, especially for cartoon things. There's not as much detailing going on. It's much easier. It's definitely the hardest part, is to just get those shapes right, get the silhouette that you want, especially for a piece like that, because it's very much unnatural. Flying islands don't really exist in the real world, so you don't really have a good reference of where to get this from. Okay, that's looking pretty good. I'm just going to go ahead and select all of this, and this is a trick I use quite often, and I'm just going to duplicate the whole thing and rotate it 360 here, 180, sorry, and just put it at the back. So now I kind of like have the exact same thing at the back. I'm just going to delete the centerpiece here because we don't need that anymore. And I'm actually at this point going to hide the picture because I no longer need that. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go in and actually start individually selecting these shapes. And I want to create a really nice and even island. I want it to look as unnatural as possible, but yet look quite interesting and fun. I don't want to make anything that would look too real. So just using these boxes right now to get a nice silhouette out of it. So I'm just going to move this over here. That looks pretty good. I'm just going to select all of these, and here in the modifier bar you can actually select the color of the wireframe, and for some reason whenever you have multiple colors on these it always looks bad, and I'm always trying to just make things look good no matter what stage they're in. It's especially important for, you don't want to show rough things. Rough things don't appeal to people, even if you're showing it to your art director who's supposed to understand the stage you're in. He might just not like it just because of the colors somehow can put him off. So it's always good to just make your picture a little bit better by making everything nice and neat. So I'm just playing around with shapes here. I'm trying to make the size. At this point, I'm not really caring if it matches the concept as much as I care more about the silhouette. So I'm just grabbing these shapes here and just putting them in. And one more here. And I'm not really worried much about the top layer here at the top, because here I'll have a grass layer. So I'm going to create a separate shape for that. So I'm just going to make sure that I have nice rocks here. So I need to move a little bit down now. And again, I'm only caring about the silhouette. I'm not much worried about crevices and things like that, because I can always fix that in ZBrush. What my most important goal right now is just to make the silhouette look good. So I'm just going to copy one of those again. Just trying to make some smaller shapes here. This doesn't look right. I'm just going to extrude those out a little bit. Push those a little bit in. And maybe just scale these vertices over here. And again, whenever I do a block out, I don't really look at it as, the final shape. I only look at it as something that would really help me in ZBrush, because you could really do all that in ZBrush, but it's just a little bit more painful, because you kind of, you're messing with the shape a little too much, the topology gets staged. And another thing is good is whenever you work on the bigger shapes, you can always work on these stones individually and then combine them together, instead of, mushing it all together from the start and getting really overwhelmed with the amount of sculpting you have to do. So I'm just going to move those over here. In fact, I'm actually going to hide this one here. Grab one of those. And just make that scaled up a little bit. Push it around here. And that looks pretty cool. I'm just going to add a realistic rendering here and going to add a light. Gonna go standard, omni, put the shadows on. Make sure I have the lights selected from the scene. Just want to see what the shape looks like. Then I'm going to add a skylight and make the skylight multiplier by 0.1. And it looks pretty good. I like the very rigid silhouette here. So as you can see, with some lighting, it just really starts to sell the shape, because without the lighting, you know, everything mixes together. You can't really tell how distant everything is, the depth of this thing. And now I can clearly see it's actually worked out pretty well, and it's definitely ready for ZBrush. So this is it for this clip. In the next clip, we're going to go ahead into ZBrush and start polishing these out.